I hope Thierry Breton's op-ed doesn't mean that the Commission, by comparing it with 9/11, I hope the Commission isn't planning on extraordinary rendition, waterboarding, and stints in Guantanamo.
Welcome back to Uncommon Decency Season 2. It's really great to be back. Our apologies for the extended holidays, but don't worry, we haven't been idle for past weeks. We wanted to make sure we would get the most insightful guests on the podcast and hold the line over the next few months, because just like Godfather 2 was better than Godfather 1, buckle up, this should be an even better second season. Now, for this episode and the big question of our digital age, who sets the boundaries of acceptable speech in a public square increasingly convened by big tech platforms?
In the wake of the Capitol storming mob of January 6th in Washington, D.C., and the subsequent and sometimes contradictory reactions by European officials on the role of big tech platforms in both allowing first and then suppressing content that they deemed perilous, we care to reflect on where the partnership of liberal democracies that makes up the Transatlantic Alliance is headed when it comes to the intersection of civil liberties and technology. Are we seeing a parting of ways, a bifurcation of sorts, or are Europe and America instead closing ranks around a shared commitment to free speech, albeit nuanced by the distinctive policy and market conditions in each side of the Atlantic?
We have with us two distinguished experts on digital policy and speech freedoms, one from each side of the Atlantic. But before we go in, don't forget to subscribe on your podcast platform, give a like and a review. It helps us reach out to many more of you, and it gives us a motivation to keep getting fantastic guests every week.
Wonderful. Well, welcome to another episode and an altogether new season of Uncommon Decency. We're so happy to be back. We wish all of our listeners a merry and a happy new year. It's been really a hectic end to an already very hectic year, and the beginning of the new one looks to be no different. There is just so much that we want to get into in this new season. But just to begin with, we'll be discussing what looks like a bifurcation or a fracture in the way that Europe and America are addressing the challenges to free speech. There's a big regulatory component to it, but we also want to get into some of the underlying ways that our different societies are going about moderating speech as liberal democracies, where we share a commitment to having free expression, and yet we're seeing the limits and the challenges to upholding that principle in the wake of things that we've seen happen recently. Just to mention a couple, we saw the real Donald Trump Twitter handle banned by Twitter, the platform, just in the wake of the Capitol storming incident, and we also saw just a few days later the banning of Parler, the microblogging right-wing microblogging platform Parler by Amazon Web Services. But we are so blessed today to be joined by two leading experts on the issue. I'll briefly introduce them. Fran Burwell joins us from Washington, where she's a senior director at McLaughly Associates, a consultancy, and she's also a distinguished fellow of the Atlantic Council, where she spent considerable time focusing on transatlantic issues with a special focus on the digital economy. And on the other end of the line, we have Jacob Mchangama, and I really have to apologize if I'm butchering your last name, Jacob. But
It was perfect, Jorge. Thank you.
we'll go with your first names. And Jacob is an acclaimed Danish human rights lawyer based in Copenhagen, where he's the executive director of Justitia, a think tank, but he's also a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, the FIRE Foundation. Both institutions, or actually both Justitia and FIRE, are focused on civil liberties, free speech. So we're also very glad that to have Jacob, who has his own vantage point on the transatlantic picture that we're trying to draw here. And for my first question, I just wanted to, starting with Fran, and then we'll turn to Jacob. I wanted to see if we can get a brief overview of where you see the optics of these recent bans. We had an op-ed on Politico Europe, on the European edition of that paper by Thierry Breton, the commissioner, shortly after the Capitol incident, where he said, this is a 9/11 type reckoning with conspiracy theorizing on social media. We got to be very careful with what we're up against. But then, as soon as Twitter canceled the president's account, you had kind of the opposite reaction happening, where a lot of leading EU officials were very critical with that move. So, what can you tell us, Fran, about? Does this look to you like there is a fracture happening over the way that America and Europe are going about regulating free speech?
Well, I think there has been a difference for a while about the way that we regulate free speech. So this is not anything particularly new. I would also put some comments in the basket of political or bargaining maneuvering as the EU is launching a huge raft of digitally oriented regulation or proposals for regulation, the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and Digital Markets Act, as the EU tries to demonstrate that it is the regulatory superpower when it comes to the digital world. But I do think that, first off, there is an issue because content moderation is a very squishy thing to try and deal with. A famous Supreme Court justice here in the United States said it was impossible to define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. And so I think that when you see content that shouldn't be online, it's hard to define that, but you know it when you see it or when you experience it, as we all did in Washington with the storming of the Capitol. There are some differences. We hold free speech to be almost, I would say, a sacred right. And we are in the United States much more likely to allow people to say things that, quite frankly, would be considered off way too far in Europe in public settings. So you have protected as free speech people. You can, unlike in Germany, deny the existence of the Holocaust. You can make statements that are designed to incite racial or ethnic hatred. And the real test is whether it is likely to spur imminent danger. So the example always used is crying fire in a crowded theater, right? That puts a lot of people's lives at danger. And yet the courts here have upheld the ability of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, to say things that are definitely designed to incite racial hatred, but there's not an immediate threat. So that's the question of imminence or immediate threat is something that I think is a real distinction between the United States and what I understand of European illegal hate speech, which I'd love to hear about from Jacob, in terms of the incitement, even though it's not imminent, the incitement to violence or racial hatred being illegal. We do also in the United States online ban child pornography, terrorist content. There are some specific laws about threats to the president and vice president of the United States. So there are some specific, very limited exceptions to free speech, but it tends to be that the exception is limited and the protections are broader.
And Jacob, really nice segue here by Fran into your area of expertise. I just wanted to plug your recent report with Justitia that compares or looks at a range of different countries that have implemented recently in recent years what you call mandatory takedown limits, right? The amount of time that has to elapse for a problematic piece of content, right, to be taken down. And you've looked at a range of different countries in Europe that have already, long before this ever kind of took this sort of transatlantic scope, a lot of different countries that you look at, France, the UK, Germany, have been moving in a more restrictive direction. So what can you tell us about, what's your way of kind of, how do you think about comparing where we're at now?
Yeah, no. First of all, I'd say I hope Thierry Breton's op-ed doesn't doesn't mean that the Commission, by comparing it with 9/11, I hope the Commission isn't planning on, extraordinary rendition, waterboarding, and stints in Guantanamo for people who who spread conspiracy theories and hate speech online. I think that might even in Europe going a bit too far. No, no, but in all seriousness, I very broadly agree with what Fran says, that there's a difference in the approach to free speech between America and Europe. Even though there are, it would be wrong to characterize Europe as one bloc. There are very there are huge differences between European states. So Denmark, where I'm based, has traditionally had a very strong, robust protection of free speech. So here you can actually deny the Holocaust if you're so inclined. You can walk down the street with a swastika, even though we do have a law against hate speech. But all Council of Europe member states and all member states of the European Union have various forms of hate speech in bans. In fact, all the European Union has a framework decision which obliges all member states of the European Union to prohibit certain forms of hate speech, though not uniformly so. So you have different ways to target hate speech in Europe. But I think it's also important to stress that this was not something the approach in Europe and America. It's not something that was always that different. So we tend to think of America as this very hard nosed about free speech, which is true, but it's a relatively recent development. And a lot of the standards that are really speech protective in the U.S. were developed in the 60s and the 50s, and I think the reason why free speech is so strongly constitutionally protected in the U.S. Is for very strong historical reasons, namely that political, religious, and racial minorities were the ones who were the targets of censorship and repression. But in Europe, the lessons from history have been different. Here, you could say that there's a tendency of militant democracy. The great German professor Karl Löwenstein in 1937 wrote these articles about the need for democracies to fight back against fascism more militantly, and he argued that you cannot defeat fascism by just sitting on your hands. You need to crack down, including through free speech, and so that has become sort of more or less the model, especially in countries like Germany, which is understandable, and France, which of course are the most dominant countries in the EU. And the internet obviously poses a challenge to this, because from the outset, um, you have these American tech companies who set up their own rules, and then suddenly you have European states who were powerless to do something about the spread of speech that they felt were dangerous, would undermine European values and European limits on free speech. But I would say that I think you could argue that Europe has won, if not the war, then at least important battles. Because if you look at the sort of civil libertarian ethos that inspired by First Amendment ideals that guided American tech platforms up until, I would say, like 5 or 7 years ago, you had Twitter famously saying that they were the free speech wing of the free speech party. And they had sort of really lax terms of service. And then compare it with now, where these platforms, they emphasize safety and preventing harm. You have seen a huge scope creep in their terms of service and community standards, with more and more categories of prohibited speech. And you've seen an almost exponential increase in the amount of purge content. This idea that social media is a lawless Wild West, I think, is a myth, and that is to a huge degree due to the fact that Europe has fought back. So you starting in 15 or in 2015 or 16 with this with this voluntary code of conduct where big tech committed to purging illegal hate speech within 24 hours, and then Germany was not happy with that, so they adopted a legally binding law, the NetzGG, under which you can be fined millions of euros if you don't remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours. So I would say that Twitter and Facebook have basically modeled now their content moderation or their community standards and their content moderation policies more on European standards than American standards. So arguably, you have a situation where Americans are subject to moderation without representation based on standards that are pushed in Brussels and Berlin.
Well, this is such a good way to throw the ball back on Fran's court, because she was right at the very start. She launched her introductory remarks with a hint of what the EU's been trying to do across several obviously policy areas, and Fran looks at digital policy on the whole, and this would include obviously, for instance, privacy as well, where the EU has also been a global leader. But it does seem as Jacob is alluding that the EU just has obviously a considerable market power to shape global regulations to fit its own standards, because obviously these companies have to abide. It's easier for them to abide with one framework when it's a European framework. And Fran, I know you've worked a lot and looked a lot at the DSA and what the EU is trying to do. It looks like in the wake of recent events, there seems to be, in this ongoing effort to shape up the next big digital legislation, it seems like there's an effort to beef up the chapter about regulating harmful speech, conspiracies, and things of the sort. What does good look like? What are you expecting from DSA? How do you see the legislation evolving?
Well, I think in terms of online speech, what the DSA is doing is essentially moving the German NetzDB to a European level. A few modest changes, but it's making a firm regulation out of the code of conduct that Jacob mentioned. And I think the code of conduct, the major tech companies have actually done pretty well in the code of conduct in terms of the number of responses that the number of complaints that they respond to, and the percentage of takedowns. But of course, that does nothing for the platforms that don't participate. And I should say that all the major US platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Google, they all participate in or were participating in the code of conduct. I think one of the interesting things is not just in content moderation, but across the digital regulatory framework, what we have seen is a US perception that the rules for the traditional economy can be adopted and used for the digital economy. While in Europe, we have seen new rules emerge for the digital economy, or a very conscious effort to apply rules for the traditional economy that regulated, say, hate speech in newspapers and things like that, applied very strictly to the digital economy. And I think that we are now facing in the United States a shift in sympathies where both the conservatives are attacking the platforms, especially social media, for, in their view, censoring them by taking down content. And at the same time, others are very concerned about the spread of violent and inciting content, as well as fake news, which is a whole different area, through the internet. And I do think that during this next Congress, the 2 years of the next Congress, we will see efforts to reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which which provides liability protections for platforms, just as the DSA will still do. It provides protections for platforms for things that are put up by their users, whether it's a YouTube video or a Facebook post or something like that. What we have not seen in the United States is then an organized governmental effort to say, okay, this kind of speech falls outside the bounds and you have to take it down, because our definition of speech that would fall outside permissible bounds is so narrow, with the exception of child pornography, for example, or things that are related to criminal activities. Let's put it that way. So I think this is going to be a very tough debate in the United States. And remember that, free speech in the United States, it's protected against government bans. So these companies are certainly well within their rights to create user guidelines and enforce those user guidelines. And I do agree with Jacob that I think a lot of the user guidelines have become tougher and have followed the European experience, because these are global companies. It's easier for them to kind of think about things in a global perspective rather than having one entirely different set of rules for Europe and for the United States. But the question comes when, if you are a platform that is as dominant as Facebook, for example, and Facebook bans you, is that somehow different from if a small company that wasn't as influential, a platform wasn't as pervasive, bans you? And is that, technically, it's not, neither case is a diminution of free speech, an attack on free speech, because the government didn't ban you, right? So there's an issue here with, do we rely on the companies to do this through their, to what degree do we want further restrictions on free speech, given, and here the things that concern me are the speed with which the internet proliferates certain ideas, including conspiracy theories, etc. Do we want to address that issue in terms of restrictions, or do we rely on the companies to do it through their user guidelines, or do we have a discussion among our elected representatives about what is appropriate and what is not, given this new environment? I would also say, just to put on the table, that what we're talking about is just only part of what led to the attack on the Capitol. There are still a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of fake news. None of what we're talking about in terms of the incitement to violence, et cetera, would do anything about the people who spread lies about the validity of the election. So on all these platforms, and I think even in Europe too, there is not yet an opportunity, or there's not yet a clear mechanism for addressing disinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories, unless they veer into the violent and racist areas. So I think that's a challenge for both the US and Europe.
And Jacob, unless you want to react to what Fran said, I want to talk a little bit about Poland and Hungary, which, since the events following Capitol Hill storming and the Twitter ban and so on, they've kind of seized the optics of the bans to carve themselves a role as rivals to supranational censorship. Poland is on its way to outlawing the censorship of content that does not contravene with its domestic laws, and Hungary is also slated to do the same thing. At the Atlantic Council, Fran, you convened the Wrocław, I'm pronouncing this horribly wrong, but the Wrocław Forum in Warsaw. Wrocław Forum in Warsaw. Did the move from Hungary and Poland to kind of present themselves as champions for free speech surprise either of you, or no? Do you see that move as a bit hypocritical given the political context in these countries?
Yeah, I have to say that given the poor record of Hungary and Poland when it comes to free speech and media freedom, I don't think one should see this as a principled move to strengthen free speech. I mean, just take earlier this month, so you had a number of Polish female LGBT activists who were put on trial for blasphemy because they have put up posters of the Virgin Mary in sort of rainbow flag, and they face a punishment of up to 2 years in prison. And Orban, does not strike me as someone who's committed to diversity in opinions and media. So if I were to speculate, I think that and not completely unreasonable that Poland and Hungary have determined that the underlying values or the values that underlie the red lines that are enforced by American tech companies are very likely to cause problems for sort of the more socially conservative views on moral issues and immigration that the PIS and Fidesz promote, and so they want to fight back against Facebook and Twitter if their more conservative ideologies and supporters are being purged en masse from the platform. I do, however, think this is a very clever tactic from a purely political point of view because it pits these governments as sort of the heroic defenders against dark cosmopolitan forces that are imposing their views on ordinary Poles and Hungarians. And that is a position of strength for both these governments. It's something that they have played up to considerable success, also against the European Union and so on. So I don't think we should see this as sort of a hard-nosed principled stand by Hungary and Poland.
Yes, I largely agree with Jacob. I mean, I think that these governments are hoping to use this very cleverly, as he said, so that they, those, for example, in Poland, who want to campaign actively against LGBT rights, for example, would not find their material, even if very critical, would not find it taken down. They would have an appeal by that. So I think that we have to see how it actually works out. But I do think that it points to a larger issue, and that is that anytime um, a leading democracy puts restraints on free speech, you have to be very careful about how it's defined. And I'm going to sort of contradict myself here because there are others out there, authoritarians, watching and hoping to use how that speech has been regulated in Europe, potentially the United States, as a way of justifying its own restraints on speech. And so I think that that's something that we need to be very clear and cognizant about as a risk.
If I may jump in, I totally agree with Fran. So Justitia, my organization, we've done two reports on the global consequences of the German NetzGG law, the one that obliges dominant platforms to remove illegal content or risk fines. And so after 1 year, there were, I think, around 13 countries that had, many of them explicitly referenced the German NetzGG law. And this included Russia, Venezuela, Belarus, and the last report that we published last fall, the number of states had risen to, I think, around 23 or 24, and the latest and most problematic addition to that list was Turkey. So Erdogan's Turkey is explicitly referencing the NetzGG to say, yeah, we can crack down on the internet because the Germans are doing it. So unwittingly and probably out of good intentions, I would say that if you want to be really harsh, Angela Merkel's government has sort of created a prototype for online censorship, and which will be used by countries that don't have the same rule of law guarantees that Germany provides. Even if Germany bans much more speech than say Denmark, it still has really robust rule of law guarantees, independent courts, and free speech guarantees in its constitution, and so on. That is not the case, at least only on paper, if you go to Russia and so on. And I would say that this also has, if you look at the transparency reports from Facebook, for instance, then 2018 is when the NetzDG was passed in 2017, but it really kicked into effect from 2018. And if you look at the numbers of hate speech that was removed in 2018 in one quarter, I believe it was around maybe 4.5 million pieces of content. But in the last available quarter, it's risen to something like more than 22 million pieces of content. And to top this off, Facebook now identifies something like 95% of that content by automation, so AI, whereas it was less than 40% back in 2018. So can I claim with confidence that it's the NetzDG and its clones that is responsible for this? But I can't say that with certainty. But I definitely think it's very likely that it has played a significant part in that. So it not only has had consequences in authoritarian states around the world, but it has also meant that in order to comply with German law, Facebook and Twitter, YouTube have drastically expanded their community standards, the prohibitions therein, and much more aggressively enforced them. And I think it's interesting to see the protests now in Russia. So I read in the Moscow Times that Instagram and YouTube remove a lot of content that protesters are putting up. So pro democracy, pro Navalny, anti Putin protesters who are dependent on social media to organize, to document abuses by the police and so on. They take it down, presumably because they are under an obligation to do so under Russian law. And that's where I think it's quite pernicious the way that European democracies have gone about this, with Germany taking the lead, because free speech and democracy has been in decline for more than a decade. And so if you have democracies, liberal democracies, who are supposed to be the champions of these ideals, actually being the ones that come up with ways where it can be limited, then that, I think, points to a dark place.
Well, this is super, and I'll let Fran jump into this shortly. But we're so glad to be able to get into all of this, because I think the whole reason we wanted to bring up the example set forth by Poland and Hungary, and obviously I think there's a lot to what you just said about it being a very sort of crass political tactic that they're playing, and we may not really kind of believe that their heart is into this sort of crusade for speech freedoms. Um, Obviously, the counter argument is that they're just trying to enforce their own um, free speech laws and not have transnational platforms ban Polish speech that does not contravene Polish law. So there's I guess there's a real debate there. But the reason we're so glad to get into it is because in your recent piece that you shared, I believe this morning on Lawfare, Jacob, you speak of there being not a clear, viable equilibrium when we're discussing these issues. There's not a good or right answer. Everything, any way you go about regulating um, uh, harmful and dangerous speech is going to come is going to ripple in one way or another, and the ideal option just simply does not exist. We have these these tacticians in Poland and Hungary, kind of playing up their bona fides, and on the other we have, as you just said, we have the countries that have had this sort of the more deliberate democratism, that they've gone about regulating um, uh, harmful speech in a more deliberate way, like you said in Europe. These countries, as you said, have inspired even worse authoritarians like Russia, like Venezuela. I mean, I was really struck by your example there of Navalny, because arguably Navalny's no is no Trump is not Navalny's cup of tea. He does not like the guy, arguably, but
No,
he
but interestingly, Navalny went out and he has a Twitter thread where he says that Twitter banning Trump plays into the hands of the enemies of freedom and democracy. So and of course you can debate that, and but I think that is something that you have to take into account. But I think one of the reasons is in liberal mature democracies we tend to take free speech for granted, and the benefits, the immense benefits that we enjoy, the fact that we can sit in three different countries and have a free discussion and no fear that we will be punished, even though we criticize the European Union, Poland, Russia, and so on. We take that for granted. Those benefits are almost invisible to us. Whereas, with the internet, the harms and costs of free speech have become amplified and much more visible to us. So we see them as more consequential than the invisible benefits. Whereas if you live in Hong Kong or Belarus or Russia, then the crackdowns on social media, you feel the benefits of free speech much more directly, and the dangers of censorship much more directly on you, because you cannot take free speech for granted, because basically you do not have free speech. And that's very, very tricky to negotiate in a global world where the context differs so widely. Because obviously those who are testing the limits of free speech in liberal democracies tend to be extremists, whereas those who test the limits of free speech in authoritarian states might very well be pro-democracy
Yeah,
activists.
and Fran, I'm sure you've got a range of reactions to that, and we'd like you to get into all of that, all of them. But can I just peg onto that, onto what just Jacob just said, that you have been looking, obviously, with Biden coming into office. I think the prospect for some level, certainly some level of goodwill when it comes to regulating digital policy issues that we're going to be in a better spot than we were over the past 4 years. And I know you've looked at the different areas where digital cooperation may yield better results under Biden administration. So maybe you can get into some of that. But I thought it was so important just to underscore back to what Jacob just said, that these examples of Germany on one side wanting to play this militant democratism, but ending up inspiring some rogue authoritarians the world over in Venezuela and Russia, and on the other hand, some actual, well, some less than savory illiberal Democrats in Central Europe playing up as being real free speech defenders. This all underscores the fact that there is no easy answer, right? So maybe Fran, if you've got reactions to any of that, and then we can turn to some of the future really in transatlantic policy debates.
Sure. Well, I think that there are no easy answers. I can totally agree with that. I think that we need to distinguish between that speech that is actually regulated and that is undesirable but is not illegal. And in a report that we did just before the holidays on a digital agenda for the Biden administration with the EU, we looked forward to the Democracy Summit, the Summit of Democracies that the President Biden intends to convene sometime soon. And I think this could be an opportunity for a really hard discussion about the issue that we've just been discussing, where attempts to protect democracy from the extremes of speech lead autocrats and others, give them room to legitimate the restraints that they're putting on free speech, but also to talk about how some of the speech that is harmful but not illegal should be addressed, whether that is through counter disinformation or some other way. But I think both Europe and the United States, we have seen the rise of QAnon, for example. And I think that that is certainly destructive of our democracy. And that is something that we need to figure out whether there is a way forward for us together in that. And I think it would be better for democracies as a group to address it rather than, and to learn from each other, rather than Europe to figure out its own approach and us to figure out our own approach. There will be differences, but I think in general, my attitude is we should consult and think about best practices and how we deal with what is an international, a global phenomenon, unfortunately, together. So I do think that with the new administration now in office, um, even though it will be a while before all their people are in place, that's going to take a while. It's always very frustrating for our partners. Um, and so it will be a while before you see real policy shifts rather than rhetorical policy shifts. But I think that they are, the new administration is seized with the importance of working with Europe, certainly, and they are already beginning to focus on some of the key elements of digital policy vis-a-vis Europe. You will know that after the European Court of Justice decision in Schrems II, there has been a major issue in terms of the transfer of personal data from Europe to the United States, and there have been negotiations ongoing. And really, in a very speedy fashion, the administration has identified who is now going to lead the negotiations for the new administration. So this was someone who was identified well before you would expect it in the normal, if there had not been this crisis. So to me, that's an early indication that the administration is focusing not just on, the big platitudes about U.S. European relations and how the EU is uh, much more important to the Biden administration than it has been to previous administrations. And they're actually thinking about some of the digital issues that have been dividing us. I do think that there are going to be some tough moments ahead. Digital services tax will provide a lot of fireworks, undoubtedly, but hopefully we can get a lot of things resolved within the OECD framework for that. The Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act are going to be tough. There are a lot of US companies that are affected, and I expect that there will be some concerns expressed about it. But I think as well, it is good. It seems to me here that the climate is changing. And whereas we used to, as I said at the beginning, just say that the old rules for the traditional economy, we don't need anything beyond that for the digital economy. I think that's starting to shift here. Whether it will shift in a considered and mature direction or whether it will simply be, which I hope it is not, let's go get the big tech companies because they're big, I think is the question. And I think that the US and Europe are going to face a challenge. We have to figure out how we can deal with some of these questions. And I would say the question we've been focused on today of online speech is probably one of the most important. Um, we have to figure out what rules we want for this area and to what extent we want to regulate it, because otherwise, other countries, and I would point to China in particular, but there are others out there, will present alternatives that others around the globe will pick up. So standards in terms of digital regulation, uh, what are the rules of the road, are going to become increasingly important. Um, the COVID pandemic has only demonstrated to all of us how important the digital world is. And if the US and Europe, go separate ways, totally separate ways, we won't agree on everything, that never happens. But if we go totally separate ways, we will find that others, and the Chinese in particular, become much more dominant in the way the global rules for the digital economy are constructed. So I think we have a couple of years to try and fix this, and I think the new administration is going to try. Um, and once their people are in place, I expect that we will see a real conversation across the Atlantic on this.
To bounce back on the point you just made, If you look over the power dynamics over the past few weeks, of the reactions in Europe and America to the censorship decisions from Twitter and Facebook and others, um, there's obviously a very different reaction from Europe and America. But we have boiled this down to the issue of free speech. But could it also be an issue of sovereignty? It's going to be a very important aspect of this conversation for the years to come on free speech. It's one thing for an American to get censored by an American company. It's quite another for a European to get censored by an American company. How do you see that kind of other layer, which adds to itself to the kind of conversation we had on free speech? How this kind of other layer of sovereignty adds itself to the way this conversation will be going on for the years to come?
I think actually that when Europe starts talking about um, digital sovereignty, I think it is not always the most constructive approach. I totally understand how different it is different, exactly what you say, that to be censored by a large company that is not from your own country is, I think, if you reverse the situation, I think Americans would be upset as well. If Twitter were German and Facebook was French, um, and you had the same usage rates here in the United States, I think there would be some questions about that. And the idea of say a German social media platform suspending the account of the U.S. president, that would be very problematic. So I can see those distinctions, but I think that digital sovereignty, that phrase, sometimes ramps up the rhetoric. And I think that we need to focus, and this is where discussions about the DSA and the DMA, the artificial intelligence law that is a proposal that's likely to come out of a commission this year, the Data Governance Act that's just come out. All of these, we need to focus on the specifics of whether these are treating American firms differently from European firms. Obviously, an American firm that operates in the European market has to follow European law. But to me, there are questions when either you are setting up potentially new trade barriers with, for example, the AI law requiring approvals and certifications of AI that is not trained on European data. And we don't know how that's actually going to manifest itself in reality yet. So we have to be cautious. But and then there are, with the Digital Markets Act, they have put forward in the proposal what qualifies a company as a gatekeeper. And it looks like it will be primarily US companies, but we'll have to see and as they run through the numbers. But I would have questions about a proposal that imposes extra obligations on large companies that then turn out to be primarily American. But I think it comes down to these specifics. And while I understand the desire for Europeans to have more large European tech companies, which I think would be great. I think that when it comes down to making rules, we have to be careful not to discriminate against those that are not from the EU, unless, the EU, for example, did a toolkit for 5G security, cybersecurity, and the requirements for what makes a vendor secure or not secure for providing 5G components. Doesn't name any countries or anything like that, but it does set out certain criteria that certainly could disallow companies from certain countries, not American that I have seen yet, but Chinese. And so I think that putting out the criteria in that kind of neutral way is a potential way forward. But there are lots of specifics that are not clear from the new legislative proposals that are coming out of the commission. And so we just have to see how they, and they have put out drafts. People raised issues, raised concerns, and then when they put out the final of the Digital Governance Act, for example, a lot of those things were addressed. So I think that there's a conversation that's going on, and it needs to be encouraged.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to get Jacob's concluding thoughts here. But I'm just so happy you ended on that note there, Fran, because it you're just open up Pandora's box there. The wide range of digital issues that are going to be on our plates in the years to come, and just as you mentioned, the prospects for some level of digital cooperation on digital policy, or the prospects for that are certainly looking better with Biden, but there's so many more areas where the EU has already begun moving forth in a more sort of sovereignty direction, or as the buzzword these days, the vogue these days in Brussels is to call it strategic autonomy, and that impels, that means that a lot of lawmakers are going to be talking about other areas of digital policy where they do want to see the EU leverage its market power to shape global rules on a range of issues where, as you said, the important thing is for the conversation to be transatlantic, and for democratic societies to come together and to compare notes on how we're going about different issues. Maybe Jacob, obviously you're more of a lawyer than a policy maker, but maybe you've got some thoughts there. Would you see the potential avenues for cooperation on maybe other issues that are not necessarily on your kind of wheelhouse?
Yeah, like I said, my expertise is quite narrow. So I think I'll limit in this setting my comments to more free speech oriented, and in that area I see, the potential for cooperation of, at least when it comes to sort of legally binding rules, would be very difficult, just because I met, from the comments that I've seen Joe Biden make about Facebook, for instance, I think he would probably be sympathetic to a more European approach than sort of a hard nosed First Amendment approach. But I imagine it would be extremely difficult, even if something was to be, a law, legally binding rules could, pass through Congress. I imagine the Supreme Court would strike it down on First Amendment grounds if it was sort of modeled on a European approach, where you try to legally define certain categories of speech that would not live up to current First Amendment doctrines. So I think that would be difficult. But then, as I said, Europe, you could say that the fact that Europe has legislated not just on this but also on privacy with GDPR, means that on certain issues that Europeans wield power over American companies and over Americans, and where, the First Amendment standards have hamstrung. There was a time when everyone was fearing sort of First Amendment imperialism, that American free speech standards would be imposed on the rest of the world, because you had these because US was just so far ahead when it came to internet companies. I don't think a lot of people say that anymore, because, as I said, the standards that are being enforced and adopted by Twitter and Facebook are more in line with a European understanding of the limits of free speech. But I think, as we've talked, there is no perfect global solution. I think one hope might be more technical than legal. So moving towards more decentralization, so we don't have these huge platforms where the decision of a few people have ramifications for potentially billions of people, but where you have sort of a more horizontal, decentralized web, which was basically the vision of Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. He very much had sort of decentralization, and where users themselves had responsibility for moderating content. So if we had a time machine and could go back to sort of the glory days of the blogosphere, no one would care about what a neo-Nazi blog with 50,000 or 100,000 worldwide followers, what they spewed of hatred, because it wasn't really that consequential, and you had a much more organic um, content moderation, that allowed you to shop around for whatever platform or website that you thought was most to your liking, and that I think was much more conducive, if even if more anarchic also sometimes, to free speech. And I think that's a general rule. Looking back at 2,500 years of free speech history, I would say as a general rule, decentralization is conducive to free speech, whereas centralization and sort of central choke points where an authority, whether it be private or government, can sort of can restrict free speech from the top down, is tends to be more dangerous to free
That's
speech.
a really good point to end on as well. We certainly wouldn't be having anything like the thorny regulatory complex puzzles that we face if we didn't have such a humongous mammoth company like Facebook, because that also entails that it's Europeans have to regulate how Facebook operates in our market, and so that's a very enlightening note to end on. We're so grateful that you were both able to join us. Thank you so much for your time.
So Fran and Jacob are out. Jorge, what did you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to take the chance to maybe kind of remind our audience here what the purpose of the episode was, as it may not have been very clear at the start. I mean, the whole notion of this episode sprang in conversation you and I had over text, where I believe it was the day or the day after the Capitol storming incident, where or I guess this would have been the day after, when we had in Politico. We had Thierry Breton, who is the EU commissioner for what is it, civil liberties, or whatever his portfolio is. But he came out with a very strongly worded op-ed saying, "Look at these social media platforms and their noxious ability to spread fake news and misinformation to an extent that endangers democracy." Remember, that was right in the wake of the Capitol storming incident. That was, if not the day after, then 2 days out. And that really kind of started, that really launched this debate, got it going in the EU, where a lot of people said, "Look, we've got to be very wary that something of that nature could happen in Europe as well, and we've got to have the tools to regulate online media so that misinformation is tamed." And it doesn't find kind of a hub in places like Twitter. And then obviously a few days later, I believe it was a week after, Twitter banned the real Donald Trump account, which is the former president's personal account. And right then and there, you had the opposite, almost the exactly opposite reaction coming out of some of the European capitals. You had, I think, Merkel was among the first ones to say, "Look, we shouldn't be." I mean, yes, misinformation is a danger, but the platform shouldn't take it upon themselves to regulate speech. Certainly not the speech of someone as important as the president of the United States. Right? I mean, this was still some days out before the inauguration, so Trump was still in office. And the idea for the episode, and I'll close with this, was just to get a debate going on whether, I mean, what is that? Those two very different reactions. What do they tell us about where we are at as a kind of a community of liberal democracies, America and Europe, where we're at in terms of regulating speech? What is each kind of each side of the Atlantic? How is each side of the Atlantic tackling the issue? Are we diverging? Are we bifurcating? Are we parting ways? Are the attitudes diverging? And so that's kind of how it got going, and then I think we got into a lot of really interesting issues, such as you had an interesting question about Poland and the way they're going about regulating. What was your idea behind that?
So, quick note aside, Thierry Breton is a European Commissioner for the internal market, which is a huge portfolio. So on the question of Hungary and Poland, I understand the feeling that there's a lot of, the kind of surfing on the issue and presenting themselves as champions of free speech. And there's probably a bit of a It's a bit opportunistic to some extent, given the clashes over the past few months we saw on these debates. However, I do think the idea isn't awful. It's not easy. The question of who should regulate free speech, and sometimes, a lot of times, when governments try to do that, it ends up backfiring. I think, for example, a French law called the Loi Avia, which was largely based on the German NetzDG law that we talked about. And the issue with that law, it ends up inciting these companies, these big tech companies, to censor even more because they don't want to get massive sanctions, which can go. I think the French law was like 3% of revenue in France, or something massive like that.
For the sake of our audience, Francois, can you maybe walk us through? I think we did get at some point with Jacob into this issue of preventive censorship.
Yeah.
But are there any examples you can point to in the recent past in France where companies have been censoring content as a way to kind of cover their backs?
Well, I'm not sure if it's to cover their back, but I know during the pandemic, there was a lot of preventive censorship because they didn't want anything which would make them sound like they were the platform for conspiracy theories and whatnot. But I know de facto it's what's happening more and more. If you're going to get sanctioned by the law for not removing content within, I think it's for 24 hours, which is insane.
That's in the Avia law, right?
That's in the Avia law, and it was blocked by the French Constitutional Council because it considered it to be too much of an attack on liberties. It was too disproportionate.
So let's remind our audience, and just to the extent that you're aware of this case, maybe people will want to look this up on Google. But the Constitutional Court in France deemed the 24-hour takedown lapse too stringent. It thought that it was too constrained. It was too much of a constraint. So it wasn't so much that the regulation itself was poorly designed. It was that the time span that these platforms were given to take down content was too short.
Well, it's too short. Therefore, de facto, as a result, it's going to be a mass attack on free speech and whatnot. I think that's the logic behind it. If you have a week, if you have 10 days to think about it, it's very different. 24 hours, 48 hours, it's not enough time to make a proper decisions. These are complex debates. Usually the debates about free speech and or like a similar debate, what is a libel, what is fair criticism, these are complicated questions. You go for a judge, it can take a lot of time, the rest of it. And the issue now is you have these tech platforms who are doing this in glimpse of a finger like this, and to me it's an issue. So I think that the Polish and Hungarian model of only allowing censorship for things which are illegal seems like a good compromise to me. I mean, part of the conversation is simply these platforms that are too important. If Twitter was one of 20 different platforms, we wouldn't be having this conversation because you just move to another one, and and Trump may move to Parler, but we even saw that Parler is very hard to reach nowadays. Now it was removed from the Play Store and whatnot. So I think a lot of the conversation stems to the fact they're just too important, too central for us to just say, it's a free market, you can do whatever you want. Well, not really, because it's just become so central to our democracy. We can't just say, democracy and you can go somewhere else. Well, there's only one Twitter as of now, and that creates a lot of tensions.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head here, and it's almost like you have this this tongue-in-cheek libertarian reply whenever people on the right now and obviously in America, but increasingly in Europe, argue for busting up big tech or regulating big tech. You have this sort of libertarian reply that goes, actually the legal contention at the heart of this is, these platforms have the legal right to defend themselves as a platform, and they have the legal right to enforce their terms of use, right? I mean, Twitter, the libertarian sort of argument in this debate says Twitter is a legal entity, and you join on the basis of terms of use, and if you join Twitter and infringe those terms of use, Twitter should be allowed to kick you out of its platform. And it's
right? And as you said, the change that invalidates that framework is that these platforms have become so prevalent, and so much of our public discourse goes through them that that framework no longer applies if you want to uphold free speech, because essentially Twitter will be a de facto censor of speech. And I do think as well. I mean, you may not agree with this. This was Jacob's point. I disagree with Jacob entirely on sort of on diagnosing the state of free speech in a country like Poland and Hungary, but I do agree that it was slightly tactically minded of those two countries to move in on big tech and to say, you will not censor any content that does not contravene our laws. And I agree with you as well that it's a legal framework that I would go by as well. I think it's well designed, but the reason for it was tactical. I think these two countries, they for one thing, they're governed by very conservative governments, and within their political persuasion, there has been a lot of censorship in the past, so they're kind of sour on these platforms already. They're moving in and saying, they're signaling, we are a haven of free speech, and we will not bow down to the supranational censors in Silicon Valley. But I totally concur with you. It's a better model than just giving platforms free rein to do the job that in the past was done by judges and national parliaments. But
so speaking of judges, I think it's going to be interesting to see whether they will hold in the European Court of Justice, because there might be a case saying this is a excessive regulation or infringement on the capacity of companies to set standards, and it might be interesting to see if it ever gets up to the European Court of Justice. Might be something to follow.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for listening. It's been a very worthwhile episode, and we encourage everyone to head over to Apple and give us a 5-star rating. I'd be very generous of you, and stay tuned for our next episode.
See you next week.